He stood just inside the door, not moving yet. The bell above him had made a small sound when he came in, but the room went quiet in a way that didn't feel like normal quiet. More like the kind that settles when people decide something about you before you even speak. His jacket was older than the truck outside. The cuffs were worn smooth where his hands had rubbed them over the years. He noticed one of the clerks glance down at the boots, then at the jacket again. No one said hello. Behind the glass counter sat rows of pistols, clean, dark metal under bright lights. He kept his eyes there, steady, like he had in other rooms long ago where people watched and waited. He had come for one reason, his daughter. And he wasn't leaving without making sure she would be safe. He waited a moment after the door closed behind him. Not because he was unsure, just giving the room time to settle. Places like this always had a rhythm. A way people looked up when someone entered. A small nod sometimes. A greeting if they were used to seeing you. None of that happened. Two young men stood behind the long counter. One leaned on his elbows, scrolling through something on his phone. The other was wiping the same spot on the glass again and again like he had nowhere else to be. Both had already looked at him. Both had already decided something. He stepped forward anyway. The shop smelled faintly of gun oil and metal. Clean. Organized. The kind of place where every item had a precise position. Handguns rested inside the case in straight rows, different sizes, different grips. Small tags with numbers and names beside them. He moved slowly along the counter, not browsing. Looking, there was a difference. The clerk with the cloth glanced at him again. "Need something?" he said. Not rude exactly, just flat. The father stopped near the middle of the case. His eyes rested on a compact handgun with a textured grip. "Yes," he said. His voice was calm. "Low. I'm looking for something reliable." The young man set the cloth down. "For what?" The question hung there a second. The father kept his eyes on the case. "Home." That was all he said. The clerk nodded once, but the nod didn't mean agreement. It meant something else. The kind of nod people give when they think they already understand the situation. "Budget?" the clerk asked. The father finally looked up. The clerk was younger than his daughter's high school teachers. Maybe mid-20s. Clean beard. Branded hat. Trying very hard to look experienced. "I'm open," the father said. The other clerk had stopped scrolling now. Listening, without looking like he was listening. The first clerk leaned down and unlocked the glass case. Metal clicked softly. He reached in and pulled out a small pistol. "This one's popular," he said. He set it on the counter but didn't slide it toward him yet. "Simple. Cheap. Gets the job done." The father studied it. The weight of the word cheap sat in the air longer than the gun itself. He didn't touch it. "May I?" he asked. The clerk hesitated for half a second, then pushed it forward. The father picked it up carefully. His hands moved automatically, checking balance first. Grip second. Sight alignment. Small habits. Quiet ones. The clerks noticed. Not the meaning, just the movement. He lowered the pistol slightly, feeling the grip angle. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't right either. He set it down gently. "Something a little more solid," he said. The first clerk tilted his head. "That one's solid." The father nodded once. "I'm sure it is." He didn't explain further. The second clerk finally spoke from the other end of the counter. "What kind of experience you got with firearms?" The question carried something behind it. Testing. The father turned his head slightly toward him. "Some." The young man smirked faintly. "Hunting? No." The answer came simple, no elaboration. The smirk faded a little. The first clerk reached back into the case and pulled out another handgun, larger this time, more expensive. He placed it down with a small sigh, like the situation had already become mildly inconvenient. "This one's a step up," he said. The father picked it up. Better balance. His fingers rested along the frame naturally. He didn't speak while he looked at it. The silence stretched longer than the clerks expected. People usually filled silence with questions. He didn't. He just held the pistol, weighing it in his palm. Then he asked quietly, "Does this come with night sights?" The two clerks exchanged a glance. The first one shrugged. Standard sights. Night sights cost extra. The father nodded. Understood. He returned the pistol carefully, not rushed, not uncertain, just deliberate. The clerk folded his arms. You buying today? Another question with weight behind it. The father met his eyes again. Yes. That answer changed the air slightly. Money always did. Still, the skepticism stayed. You got a permit? The second clerk asked. Yes. ID? He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The movement was slow, calm. His hands were steady. When he placed the wallet on the counter and slid the card forward, the clerk picked it up quickly. Looked at the name. Looked at the address. Then looked back up at him again. Something in his expression tightened just slightly. Not recognition, just confusion. The address was from the edge of town, older neighborhood, small houses. The kind of place people didn't expect someone to be buying firearms for careful reasons. The clerk handed the ID back. You live alone? He asked. The father slid the card back into his wallet. No. Family? He hesitated. Just for a breath. My daughter. The clerk nodded slowly. How old? 17. The second clerk leaned against the counter. Bit early to be worrying about that kind of thing, isn't it? The father looked back down at the display case. His reflection stared up faintly from the glass. He thought of the front door at home, the weak lock, the nights he worked late, the silence of the house after midnight. Not really, he said. Neither clerk responded. The first one cleared his throat. Well, if you want something better than the cheap option, we've got a few higher models. The way he said cheap again wasn't subtle this time. The father ignored it. He kept studying the case, row after row of handguns, each one built for a specific purpose. Protection, control, survival. He pointed quietly to one near the end of the display. That one. The clerk followed his finger. He blinked. That's not cheap. I know. The clerk hesitated. You sure you want to look at that one? The father met his eyes again. Yes. The young man unlocked the case again. This time slower. He lifted the pistol out and set it down. Carefully. Almost reluctantly. The father picked it up. Immediately, his posture changed. Just slightly. His shoulders settled, like holding something familiar. He checked the balance, the grip, the sights. Then he nodded to himself once. The clerks saw it, and suddenly neither of them felt as certain about their earlier assumptions. But they didn't know why yet, and the father wasn't going to explain. Not unless he had to. He set the pistol down gently. This will work, he said. Neither clerk spoke right away. One of them glanced toward the back office door, then back at him. Something about the way he had handled the firearm. It didn't match the picture they had built when he first walked through the door. The pride has a way of holding people in place. So instead of asking the obvious question, the first clerk said quietly, You sure you know what you're doing with something like that? The father didn't answer immediately. He looked at the pistol one more time, then at the clerk. His expression didn't change. I do. The room went quiet again. And somewhere in the back of the store, a door opened. The door in the back opened softly, not loud enough to interrupt anything. Just enough to make the two clerks glance over their shoulders. A woman stepped out, mid-40s maybe, dark hair tied loosely behind her head. She carried a clipboard in one hand and reading glasses in the other. She didn't rush, just walked toward the counter at an easy pace, scanning something on the paper as she moved. The clerks straightened a little, not stiff, but enough that it was noticeable. Morning, she said absently. Neither clerk answered right away. They were watching the man again. He still stood at the counter, the handgun resting in front of him. Quiet, patient. The woman looked up from the clipboard. Her eyes moved across the room quickly, the way people do when they've spent years in the same place. Door. Shelves. Counter. Customer. She paused for a second, then continued walking. The father didn't look at her yet. He was studying the pistol again, not touching it, Just looking. The same way someone might look at a tool before deciding if it could be trusted. The first clerk cleared his throat. "He wants that one," he said, nodding toward the pistol. The woman stopped beside the register. "All right." She set the clipboard down and finally looked directly at the man. "Morning." "Morning," he replied. His voice carried the same calm weight as before. Not loud, just steady. She glanced down at the pistol on the counter. One eyebrow lifted slightly. "That's a good choice," she said. The clerks exchanged a quick look. The first one shrugged a little. "He says he's buying today." She nodded once. "Good." Then she looked at the man again. "Have you handled that model before?" He considered the question. "Yes." That was all. She studied his face for a second longer than most people would. Not suspicious, observing. Then her eyes drifted down to his hands resting near the counter. They were rough, scarred across the knuckles. One thin white line ran along the side of his thumb. She didn't mention it. Instead, she picked up the pistol and checked the chamber automatically. Empty. She set it back down. "You comfortable with the grip?" she asked. "Yes." "How does it feel?" "Balanced." The answer came quickly. "Natural." The clerks noticed that too. Most first-time buyers hesitated when asked questions like that. They searched for the right words. The man didn't. The woman folded her arms loosely. "You looking for home defense?" she asked. "Yes." She nodded. "Someone at home with you?" "My daughter." The same pause as before. 17. The woman didn't ask the age. She didn't need to. Instead, she said quietly, "First firearm in the house?" "Yes." The first clerk leaned forward slightly. "See, that's what we were saying," he added. "We showed him a simpler one first." The woman didn't look at him. She kept her attention on the man. "You're comfortable with something this size?" "Yes." Another short answer. Another moment of silence. The room seemed to tighten a little. The woman finally glanced toward the clerks. "Did you show him the compact series?" "Yeah," the first one said quickly. "But he wants this." Her eyes moved back to the father. "Mind if I ask why?" It wasn't an interrogation. Just curiosity. The father looked down at the pistol again. He thought of the small hallway in his house, the sound the floor made near the kitchen, the back door that never closed quite right. "This one is reliable," he said. The woman nodded slowly. "That it is." The second clerk crossed his arms. "It's also expensive." No one responded right away. The woman picked up the clipboard again, but didn't look at it. "How long have you been around firearms?" she asked the father. The clerks both watched him closely now. The father thought about the question. There were many ways to answer it. Years, places, moments he didn't talk about anymore. He chose the simplest one. A while. The first clerk gave a short breath through his nose. "That's what everyone says." The woman finally turned her head toward him. Not sharply. Just enough. "That's so," he shrugged. "Yeah, people come in here all the time saying they've handled guns before. Then they flag the whole room trying to check the sights." The father had been standing with the pistol resting flat on the counter the entire time, never pointing it, never lifting it carelessly. The woman noticed. The clerks didn't. "Did he?" she asked calmly. The first clerk hesitated. "Well, no." She nodded once. Then she turned back to the father. "May I?" She gestured toward the pistol. He slid it gently toward her. She picked it up again. Her movements were quick and practiced. Years of repetition. "Grip looks natural in your hands," she said casually. The father didn't respond. "Trigger discipline's good too." The second clerk frowned. "What?" She didn't look at him. Finger stayed off the trigger the entire time. The clerk blinked. "Oh." The woman set the pistol down again. Her eyes moved to the father's jacket for a brief moment. Old denim, faded in places. Then she looked back at his hands. The scar on the thumb again. Another faint mark near the wrist. She tilted her head slightly. "Where'd you say you learned to handle firearms?" The father didn't answer immediately, not because he was hiding anything, just because the question opened doors he usually kept closed. Work, he said finally. The first clerk chuckled lightly. Security? No. The clerk waited. But the father didn't continue. Silence returned. The woman watched him a moment longer. Then she reached down and picked up the paperwork for the sale. All right, she said. The clerks looked surprised. Wait, the first one said. Shouldn't we? She held up a hand gently. He has a permit. The father had already placed it on the counter again. She glanced at it briefly, then at his ID. Her eyes moved across the name, stopped. Something in her expression shifted. Small, almost invisible, but real. She looked at the ID again, then back at him. Mr. Hale, she said quietly. The father's eyes lifted slightly. Yes. She studied his face again, longer this time. The clerks looked between them, confused. The woman slowly set the ID down. Then she asked a question that changed the room. You served, didn't you? The question settled into the room quietly. You served, didn't you? The father didn't answer right away. Not out of hesitation, just habit. Years had taught him that words carried weight when you used them carelessly. Most of the time it was easier not to. He looked at the woman. She wasn't smiling, wasn't trying to make a moment out of it, just waiting. Yes, he said. The two clerks shifted slightly behind the counter. It wasn't the answer that surprised them. Plenty of people had served. It was the way he said it. No pride in it. No explanation either. Just a fact. The woman nodded once. What branch? Army. The younger clerk leaned his weight onto one elbow again, though the earlier confidence in his posture had softened. How long? The father didn't look at him. A while. The clerk gave a short breath through his nose again, like he had earlier. Everyone says that too. The woman glanced toward him, not sharply. But it was enough. He looked away. The father kept his eyes on the pistol resting on the counter. The steel reflected the overhead lights in a dull line. Infantry? The woman asked. Yes. That answer came quicker. She watched him for a moment. There was something familiar about the way he stood. Not rigid, not trying to look disciplined, just balanced. Still, people carried certain things with them long after they left places. Posture was one of them. So you've had some training, she said. Yes. Another short answer. The clerks were quiet now. The first one finally spoke again. Well, that makes sense then. The tone had shifted slightly. Not respectful yet, just less dismissive. The father didn't react. The woman picked up the pistol again and turned it slightly in the light. This model's reliable, she said. But it's not forgiving if someone doesn't know what they're doing. He nodded. I know. You planning to keep it secured? Yes. Lockbox? Yes. Again the answers came without hesitation. Not rehearsed, just settled. The woman set the pistol down. What made you decide now? She asked. The father rested his hands on the edge of the counter. For a moment he didn't speak. The clerks waited too, though they weren't sure why. The answer came slowly. My daughter's home alone sometimes. He didn't add anything else. Didn't describe the house. Didn't mention the nights he worked late shifts at the warehouse outside town. Didn't talk about the strange car that had idled down the street twice last week. He just said that one sentence. The woman nodded once. That makes sense. The first clerk scratched the side of his beard. You know she can't legally use it yet, right? The father looked at him calmly. Yes. So, it's just for you? Yes. The clerk hesitated. Well, if she's home alone, the father met his eyes. I didn't say she'd be using it. The room quieted again. The second clerk shifted awkwardly. The woman watched the father closely, not judging, just measuring something. You teach her about safety? She asked. Yes. Already? Yes. How old did you start? 14. The clerks exchanged a glance. 14, the first one repeated. The father nodded. Safety first. The woman allowed a small, almost invisible smile. That's the right order. The clerk leaned back slightly. Still seems young. The father didn't argue. He simply said, she knows the rules. The woman turned toward the register and began pulling the sale paperwork forward. The printer hummed quietly for a second. While it ran, the first clerk folded his arms again. "So, where'd you serve?" he asked. The father's gaze drifted briefly toward the window at the front of the shop. Morning light stretched across the floor in pale lines. Different places. The clerk smirked faintly. "That narrows it down." The father didn't react. The woman did. "That'll do," she said calmly. The clerk shrugged. "Just making conversation." The father spoke before the moment could stretch too far. "Mostly overseas." The clerk nodded slowly. "Combat?" The question hung there. It wasn't asked cruelly, just carelessly. The father thought about it. Memories surfaced quickly when people asked questions like that. Not clear images, more like flashes. Dust. Noise. The weight of gear pressing against his shoulders. He looked back at the counter. "Yes." The word was quiet. The room seemed smaller for a moment. The second clerk cleared his throat. "Well, that explains the way you checked the grip earlier." The father didn't answer. The printer stopped. The woman lifted the papers and set them on the counter between them. "Background check will process in a few minutes," she said. He nodded. The clerks watched him again, but differently now. Curiosity had replaced the earlier judgment. Still, pride didn't let people admit when they'd been wrong too quickly. The first clerk tapped the glass lightly with his knuckle. "You retired?" "No." "Still active?" "No." "Then what?" The father looked at him. "Working." "Doing what?" "Warehouse." The clerk blinked. "Warehouse?" "Yes." The second clerk frowned slightly. "After the army." "Yes." He seemed confused by that answer. "Why?" The father thought about that. The real answer had many pieces. Coming home. Trying to sleep. Trying to sit in rooms without scanning every door and corner. Trying to live quietly. He chose the simplest version. It's work. The clerk rubbed the back of his neck. "Huh." The woman finished filling out a section of the paperwork. Then she paused. Her eyes returned to the father's ID again. The name sat there plainly. Hale. Something about it had tugged at her memory earlier. Now it returned. She looked up again. "You said Army," she said. "Yes." "What unit?" The father hesitated. "Only a second. 3rd Battalion." The woman went still. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she searched through something in her memory. The clerks noticed. "What?" the first one asked. She didn't answer right away. She was still looking at the father. Then she asked quietly, "3rd Battalion, 75th." The question stayed in the air a moment. "3rd Battalion, 75th?" The father didn't move, not even a shift in his shoulders, but something behind his eyes settled into a quieter place, the way it did when old names surfaced. "Yes," he said. Neither clerk understood the weight of the number. The woman did. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the paperwork, but she wasn't looking at it anymore. "You were Ranger Battalion," she said. Not a question this time. The father gave a small nod. The first clerk looked between them. "Ranger like the Army Rangers?" "Yes," the woman answered before the father could. The clerk blinked. "Oh." The room felt different now. Not dramatic, just rearranged somehow. The father stood the same way he had since walking in, hands resting near the counter. Jacket sleeves worn at the cuffs. Nothing about him had changed, only the way people were seeing him. The second clerk leaned forward slightly. "You were Special Forces?" The father shook his head once. "No." The woman spoke again. "Rangers aren't Special Forces," she said calmly. "Different role." The clerk nodded quickly like he understood, even though he didn't really. The father's attention drifted back toward the pistol on the counter. He preferred when conversations stayed simple. The woman studied him again. "How long were you in battalion?" The father thought for a second. 8 years. The first clerk let out a quiet whistle before he could stop himself. 8? The father didn't react. "Multiple deployments?" the woman asked. "Yes." Again the answer stayed small. "Contained?" The clerks waited, maybe expecting more. Stories. Details. Something impressive. Nothing came. The woman finally leaned one elbow on the counter. "My brother served," she said. The father looked up slightly. "Army?" "Marines." He nodded once. "Different life," she added. "Yes." For a moment the conversation slowed into something quieter, a kind of understanding that didn't need explaining. The first clerk shifted awkwardly. "So you did all that, and now you're working at a warehouse?" The father looked at him. "Yes." The clerk rubbed the back of his neck again. "Huh." The second clerk spoke more carefully this time. "You ever think about security work or something like that?" The father's gaze moved briefly toward the front window again. Cars passing outside. "Normal morning. I thought about a lot of things," he said. The clerk nodded slowly. The background check terminal behind the counter beeped softly. The woman stepped over and glanced at the screen. "Still processing," she said. Then she looked back at the father. "You said your daughter's 17. "Yes." "What's her name?" He hesitated. Not because it was private, just because saying her name out loud in unfamiliar rooms always made him feel responsible in a deeper way. "Lena." The woman smiled faintly. "That's a good name." The first clerk leaned against the counter again, though now he seemed unsure how casual he should be. "You teach her to shoot already?" The father shook his head. "Not yet. But safety? Yes." The clerk nodded slowly. "Probably smart." The second clerk looked down at the pistol again. "That model you picked. Not a beginner's gun." "I know. You comfortable with it?" "Yes." The father picked it up again. Just briefly. His grip settled naturally, fingers straight along the frame. The clerks noticed the same thing the woman had earlier. Everything about the way he handled it was controlled, quietly precise. He set it back down. The woman watched him carefully. "You carry before?" she asked. "Yes." "Military only?" "Yes." She nodded. "Different world?" "Yes." So first clerk cleared his throat. "So, you ever see combat?" The father didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the counter again. Memories moved behind his eyes for a moment. Then he said simply, "Yes." The clerk waited, but again nothing else came. No stories, no details, just the one word. The silence after it was heavier this time. The woman changed the subject gently. "You living close by?" "Yes." "Old neighborhood east of the highway?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Quiet area. Usually." The word usually stayed in the air. The woman noticed. "You've had trouble?" The father thought about that. He remembered the late-night knock on the neighbor's door 2 weeks ago. The police lights. The car circling the block slowly 3 nights later. He answered carefully, "Nothing yet." The woman understood that answer too. Still, better to be prepared. "Yes." The background check terminal beeped again. She stepped over and read the screen. "Approved." The word was simple, but the clerks both relaxed slightly. The woman returned to the counter and began completing the last section of paperwork. "All right," she said, "we can finish this up." The father nodded. He reached for his wallet again. The first clerk spoke before he could. "Wait." Everyone looked at him. He shifted his weight. 8 years in Ranger Battalion. You must have been decorated or something. The father paused. He didn't like where conversations went when that subject came up. "It was a long time ago," he said. The clerk shrugged. "Still." The woman watched the father closely. "You don't talk about it much," she said. "No." "Why?" The father thought about that question. There were many reasons. Most of them didn't belong in rooms like this. Finally he said, "Because it's over." The woman held his gaze a moment longer. Then she nodded. "I understand." The clerks didn't, but they stopped asking. The father placed his credit card on the counter. The woman picked it up and ran the payment through the register. The receipt printed slowly. While it did, she glanced once more at the father's hands resting near the counter. The scars, the steady stillness. Then her eyes moved briefly toward the clerks. Something in her expression had changed. They didn't notice yet, but they would soon, because the way she handled the rest of the transaction was not going to be ordinary. The receipt printed slowly. The machine made a thin, grinding sound before the paper finally slid out. The woman tore it carefully along the edge and set it beside the register. The father signed without looking at the amount, not because he didn't care, just because he had already decided before walking in that morning that the cost didn't matter. His daughter did. He slid the receipt back toward her. "Thank you," he said. The woman glanced at the signature. Hale. Her eyes lingered on it for a moment. Then she reached beneath the counter and removed the pistol from the display mat again. She checked the chamber one more time out of habit, though she already knew it was empty. The clerks watched quietly now. Earlier they had been talking over each other. Now they seemed unsure where to stand in the conversation. The woman placed the pistol back on the counter in front of the father. "We'll get you a case," she said. He nodded. "Thank you." She walked toward the shelving behind the counter and pulled down a hard plastic case. Black. Simple. The kind that locked cleanly. When she returned, she set it down gently and opened the lid. "Magazines and locker inside," she said. The father leaned slightly forward to look. Everything was arranged neatly. He appreciated that. The first clerk finally spoke again, though his voice had softened. "So, 8 years in Ranger Battalion." The father didn't answer. The clerk continued anyway. "That's pretty serious stuff." The father closed the case slowly once the pistol had been placed inside. The click of the latch was quiet but firm. "It's just time served," he said. The clerk frowned slightly. "That's not really just anything." The father didn't respond. The woman watched the exchange quietly. Then she rested one hand on the counter. "You ever stationed at Fort Benning?" she asked. The father looked up. "Yes." She nodded. "My brother trained there." He considered that for a second. "What year?" she told him. The father nodded again. "Busy years." The woman smiled faintly. "That's what he said." The room felt calmer now. Not tense the way it had been earlier. Still quiet, though. The father picked up the case handle but didn't lift it yet. He wasn't rushing. The first clerk leaned forward again, studying him more carefully this time. "You don't really look like a ranger," he said. The sentence came out before he could stop it. The woman looked at him. "What's that supposed to mean?" The clerk shifted. I just expected." He stopped. The father saved him from finishing. "Something louder?" The clerk blinked. "Maybe." The father nodded slightly. Most of the loud ones didn't last very long. The room went silent again. The second clerk looked down at the counter. The first one rubbed the back of his neck. The woman watched the father with quiet interest. "You live close?" she asked. "About 10 minutes." "Good." She gestured lightly toward the case. "You'll want to keep that secured." "I will." "For your daughter?" "Yes." The father finally lifted the case. It wasn't heavy, but the weight of the decision still sat somewhere deeper than the handle in his hand. He turned slightly toward the door, then paused. The woman had stepped around the counter. That alone made the clerks look up. She walked toward him slowly. "Mr. Hale." He stopped. "Yes." She extended her hand. "Thank you for your service. It wasn't loud. It wasn't ceremonial. Just direct." The father hesitated for half a second. People said those words sometimes in ways that made him uncomfortable, like they expected something back from him. But the way she said it carried no performance. Just respect. He shifted the case to his other hand and shook hers. "Thank you," he said quietly. The clerks watched. Something in their expressions had changed. Not embarrassment exactly, but awareness. The woman turned slightly toward them. "You boys know how many people make it 8 years in a Ranger battalion?" Neither clerk answered. She looked at them calmly. "Not many." The first clerk swallowed. "Oh." The father shifted his weight slightly. "You don't have to make a speech," he said gently. The woman smiled a little. "I know." But she didn't move away yet. Instead, she turned back toward the counter. "Give me a second," she said. The clerks looked confused. She opened the register again. The father watched quietly. "What are you doing?" the second clerk asked. The woman pulled the receipt back out. Then she typed something into the register. A small refund slip printed. The clerk leaned forward. "Wait, that's—" She tore the slip off. Then she walked back to the father and handed it to him. He looked down. The amount was half the purchase price. He frowned slightly. "I think there's been a mistake." "No," she said calmly. "There hasn't." He shook his head. "I paid already." "Yes." He held the slip up slightly. "This is a refund." "Yes." The father looked at her again. "You don't need to do that." She folded her arms loosely. "I know." The room had gone very quiet again. The clerks watched, unsure if they should say something. The father held the slip for a moment longer. "I can afford the firearm," he said. "I'm sure you can." "Then why?" The woman glanced briefly toward the two clerks behind the counter, then back at him. "Because respect matters," she said. The clerks looked down. The father studied her face. Still calm. Still matter of fact. No performance. Just a decision. He looked at the refund slip again, then carefully placed it back on the counter. "I appreciate the gesture," he said, "but I'd rather pay the full price." The woman didn't look surprised. She had expected that answer. Still, she pushed the slip gently back toward him. "Then think of it as the store saying thank you." The father didn't reach for it yet. The clerks were very still now, because something about the moment had quietly turned into a lesson, and they both knew it. The father finally picked up the slip. He studied it again. Then he said quietly, "My daughter will appreciate the savings." The woman smiled. "That's what I was hoping." The refund slip stayed in his hand for a moment. Thin paper, warm from the register. He folded it once and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, next to his wallet, the same pocket where he kept a small photo of Lena from 2 summers ago. She had been laughing in that picture, hair pulled back, sunlight all across her face. He didn't think about that photo now, but his hand paused a second longer than necessary before leaving the pocket. "Thank you," he said again. The woman nodded. "You're welcome." Neither of them tried to stretch the moment into something bigger. The clerks still stood behind the counter, quiet in a way they hadn't been earlier. The first one finally spoke. "Sorry if we, He stopped. The words didn't seem to line up properly. The father looked at him. "It's all right." The clerk shook his head slightly. "No, I mean, we kind of assumed." He stopped again. The father didn't help him finish. After a second, the clerk said it anyway. "We thought you were just, you know." The father waited. The young man exhaled through his nose. Some guy coming in off the street trying to buy something he didn't really understand. The father gave a small nod. "That happens." The clerk looked relieved he wasn't being lectured. "Yeah." The woman leaned back against the counter beside them. "Assumptions are easy," she said. Neither clerk argued. The second one glanced to the father. "You handled that pistol like you'd held it 1,000 times." The father lifted the case slightly in his hand. "More than that." The clerk gave a quiet half laugh. "Yeah, I guess so." For a moment no one said anything. Morning light had shifted across the floor now. The sun had climbed higher, pushing a long stripe of brightness across the entrance rug near the door. Outside, a truck rolled past slowly, life moving like normal. The father looked toward the door. He should go. There was work later. A shift that started in the afternoon. Boxes to move. Forklifts humming across concrete floors. Simple work. The kind that kept his mind quiet, but he stayed where he was another moment. The woman noticed. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Yes." He nodded toward the counter. "I appreciate what you said earlier." She tilted her head slightly. "About respect?" "Yes." "That part matters," she said. The father studied the room briefly. The rows of firearms, the clean glass cases. The clerks now looked slightly uncomfortable with themselves. Then he said something that surprised them. "Most of the time I don't tell people." The woman understood immediately what he meant. "About your service." "Yes." The first clerk frowned. "Why not?" The father thought about that. His eyes drifted briefly toward the window again. People walking along the sidewalk outside. Normal morning. Then he answered. Because it doesn't belong to them. The room went quiet again. The clerks seemed to be considering that. The woman nodded slowly. That's fair. The second clerk leaned on the counter again, though much more carefully now. My uncle talks about his time in the army all the time, he said. The father gave a small shrug. Everyone carries it differently. The clerk nodded. Yeah. Another small silence settled in. Then the woman stepped away from the counter again and walked to a shelf near the wall. She picked up a small lockbox. Simple steel. Keypad on the front. When she came back, she set it beside the case the father was holding. You mentioned securing the firearm, she said. Yes. Take this too. He looked down at it. That's not necessary. I know. You've already been generous. She shrugged lightly. I own the place. The father looked at her. Still. She tapped the lockbox once with her fingers. Call it part of the same thank you. The father considered it, then nodded. All right. He picked it up. Solid weight. Useful. For Lena, the woman said. The father nodded again. Yes. The first clerk shifted slightly. Is she going to learn to shoot? Eventually. You'll teach her? Yes. The clerk seemed curious now, rather than skeptical. That's kinda cool. The father didn't smile, but something softer moved across his expression. She'll learn safety first. The woman nodded. Good. The second clerk looked at the case again. You nervous about having a firearm in the house? The father thought about the question, then answered honestly. A little. The clerk seemed surprised by that. Really? Yes. Even after everything? The father looked at him calmly. Especially after everything. The room went quiet again. The woman watched the father carefully. She understood the meaning behind that sentence. The clerks didn't fully. But they felt it. The father shifted the case and lockbox comfortably in his hands. I should get going. The woman nodded. Of course. He took a step toward the door. The bell above it waited quietly. Just before he reached it, the first clerk spoke again. Mr. Hale? He turned slightly. Yes? The young man hesitated. Then he said something much simpler than before. Thank you. The father studied him for a moment, then nodded. You're welcome. He pushed the door open. The bell rang softly above him. Morning air drifted in cooler than inside the shop, carrying the faint smell of wet pavement and gasoline from the street. He stepped outside. The door closed behind him. Inside the shop, the room stayed quiet for a few seconds after he left. The clerks both looked toward the window where his truck sat parked at the curb. The woman folded the paperwork slowly. Then she said something without raising her voice. You see how easy it is to misread someone? Neither clerk answered. They didn't need to, because the lesson had already landed. And outside, the father placed the case gently on the passenger seat of his truck. He paused before closing the door. Just for a moment. Thinking about Lena, about the quiet house, about the promise he carried every day without saying it out loud. Then he closed the door and drove home. The drive home was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. Just ordinary silence inside the truck while the engine hummed and the tires moved over the road. The father kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly near the gear shift. The gun case sat on the passenger seat, the lockbox beside it. Every time the truck slowed at a light, his eyes drifted toward them for a second. Not out of worry, just awareness. Responsibility had weight. He had learned that a long time ago. The road through town was already busy. The delivery van stopped halfway into the lane ahead of him. Someone crossed the street carrying 2 bags of groceries. A dog barked somewhere behind a fence. Normal things. He appreciated normal things now. 10 minutes later, he turned off the main road. The houses grew smaller there. Older. Most of them had been built before he was born. Wood siding. Narrow driveways. Lawns that stayed uneven no matter how often people cut them. His house sat near the end of the block. white paint that had faded into something closer to gray, a small porch with one step that creaked if you didn't place your foot carefully. He pulled into the driveway and turned the engine off. The truck ticked quietly as it cooled. For a moment he stayed seated, looking at the house. It had been quiet inside that house for many years before Lena came along. After her mother left, the rooms had felt larger than they should have. Too much space for two people learning how to live without someone else. But Lena had filled it. Her voice, her music, drifting from her room, the soft thud of her shoes in the hallway when she ran late for school. He picked up the case, then the lockbox, and stepped out. The porch step creaked the way it always did. Inside, the house smelled faintly like coffee and laundry detergent. He set the case down on the kitchen table. Lena wasn't home yet. School would still be in session for another hour. He stood there a moment looking at the case. Black plastic. Plain. Nothing dramatic about it. Just an object. But it represented a decision he had been thinking about for weeks. He opened the cabinet above the refrigerator and pulled down a small toolbox. Inside were a few screws, a drill bit, and an old electric drill he'd owned for years. He placed the lockbox on the floor beside the cabinet near the pantry, low enough that it stayed hidden, high enough that it couldn't be reached easily without knowing where it was. He measured the space with his eyes, then knelt down and started working. The drill buzzed softly against the wood. 2 screws first, then 2 more. He tightened them slowly, making sure the box didn't shift even a little. After a few minutes, he pulled on it gently. Solid. He set the pistol inside, closed the lid, entered the code. The lock clicked. He stood up again. The kitchen looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Coffee mug still sitting in the sink. A school paper Lena had left on the table. Her handwriting curved across the top. History essay. He glanced at the clock. 40 minutes. He washed his hands and poured himself a glass of water. Then he sat down, waiting. Outside, the sound of a school bus eventually rolled down the street. He heard the door open across the road at the neighbor's house. The dog barked again. Then a few minutes later, the front door opened. "Dad?" Her voice carried down the hallway. "In the kitchen," he answered. Lena appeared a moment later. Backpack slung over one shoulder. Hair slightly messy from the wind outside. 17 years old. She looked tired in the way teenagers often did after a long day of school. But when she saw him sitting there, she smiled. "You're home early." He nodded. "Stop somewhere after work." She dropped her backpack beside the table and reached into the refrigerator. "What kind of somewhere?" He took another sip of water. "A store." She raised an eyebrow. "That's mysterious." He gave a small shrug. "Gun store." She stopped mid-motion with the refrigerator door open. "You actually did it." "Yes." Her expression changed quickly. Not fear, more like curiosity mixed with seriousness. "You bought one?" "Yes." She closed the fridge slowly. "Where is it?" He pointed toward the cabinet. "In a lockbox." She looked at the cabinet for a moment, then back at him. "You trust me with that?" The question wasn't light. It carried more weight than most things she asked. He answered carefully. "I trust you with the rules." She nodded once. That was enough. She sat down across from him. "What kind did you get?" He described it simply. She listened. Her interest wasn't excitement. It was focus. He appreciated that. After a moment, she asked, "Are you going to teach me?" "Yes." "When?" "Soon." She leaned back in the chair. "Range?" "Yes." "Safety first?" "Always." She smiled a little. "Good." For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then she looked at him again. "Why today?" The father thought about that. How to explain something that wasn't one moment, but many small ones adding up. Finally, he said, "I'd rather have it and not need it." She nodded slowly. That answer made sense to her. After a moment, she stood up again and grabbed an apple from the counter. As she walked past him toward the hallway, she paused. Then she said something quietly. "Thanks, Dad." He looked up. For what? She shrugged lightly. For thinking ahead. Then she disappeared down the hallway toward her room. The father sat at the kitchen table a little longer, listening to the normal sounds of the house again. A door closing. Music starting softly down the hall. He looked once toward the cabinet where the lockbox sat. Hidden. Secure. And for the first time in a while, the house felt just a little more protected. That evening settled slowly. The house had its usual sounds again. Lena's music from her room. The occasional thud of something dropped on the floor. The quiet creak of pipes when someone ran water in the bathroom. Normal things. The father stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing a plate. He had made something simple for dinner. Eggs. Toast. Lena had eaten quickly, talking about a math test she thought she might have done well on. Now she was back in her room. He dried his hands on the towel and glanced toward the cabinet where the lockbox was installed. Still closed. Still quiet. That was how he preferred it. He walked into the living room and sat down on the old couch near the window. The cushions dipped in the familiar way they always had. Across the street, a porch light flicked on. Night was coming. He rested his elbows on his knees and stared out at the road for a moment. Cars passed every few minutes, headlights sweeping briefly across the front of the house before disappearing again. Years ago, he used to sit like this in other places, different houses, temporary ones, watching roads in a different way. He didn't do that anymore. Most nights, he tried to think about ordinary things instead. Rent, work schedules, groceries, things that belonged to this life. Footsteps came down the hallway. Lena appeared in the doorway. Dad? Yes? She leaned against the frame. You busy? No. She walked in slowly. Can we talk about the gun for a minute? He nodded toward the chair across from him. She sat. For a moment she didn't speak. Her hands rested loosely in her lap. You remember when you taught me the stove rules? She asked. He nodded. Of course. Same idea. Yes. She nodded slowly. That makes sense. He waited. She looked toward the hallway briefly, then back at him. I'm not scared, she said. I know. But it does make things feel more serious. He considered that. Yes. She gave a small sigh through her nose. I think that's good, though. Why? Because you don't do things unless they matter. He studied her face for a moment. She had grown so much in the last year. Taller, more thoughtful in the way she spoke. Sometimes it surprised him. You remember the safety rules? He asked. Yes. Tell me. She didn't hesitate. Always treat it like it's loaded. He nodded. Keep your finger off the trigger unless you're ready to shoot. Yes. Never point it at anything you're not willing to destroy. He watched her carefully. And? She thought for half a second. Know what's behind your target. He nodded again. That's right. She leaned back slightly in the chair. You really did start teaching me this stuff a while ago. Yes. Before you even owned one. Yes. She smiled faintly. That's kind of funny. The father didn't smile, but his voice softened a little. It's easier to teach responsibility before the object exists. She nodded. Yeah. Another quiet moment passed. Then Lena asked something that made him pause. Did you carry one every day in the army? Yes. Was that weird at first? The father thought about it. Yes. How long until it wasn't? A few weeks. She studied his face carefully. You don't miss it, do you? The question surprised him. He shook his head slowly. No. Not even a little? No. She seemed to believe him. Good. She stood up and stretched slightly. Are we going to the range this weekend? Yes. Her face brightened just a little. Okay. She walked toward the hallway again, then stopped halfway. Oh, one more thing. Yes? She turned around. What kind of gun shop was it? The father leaned back slightly on the couch. Small one. Nice people? He thought about the two clerks behind the counter, the way they had looked at his jacket when he first walked in. Then he thought about the woman who owned the place. Yes, he said. Lena tilted her head. That sounded like a story. It's not much of one. She crossed her arms. You say that about every story. The father considered that. Maybe she was right. Just a normal morning, he said. She watched him a moment longer. Then she smiled. Those are usually the best kind. She disappeared down the hallway again. Her door closed a moment later. The father remained on the couch. Outside, the street had grown darker. The porch light across the road cast a long yellow glow over the pavement. He sat there, thinking about the morning, about the gun shop, about the moment the woman had recognized something the others had missed. It wasn't the refund that stayed with him. It was the way she had looked at the clerks afterward, not angry, just firm, teaching something without raising her voice. Respect. That word had stayed with him all day. Finally, he stood up and walked back into the kitchen. He opened the cabinet and looked at the lockbox, then closed the door again. Everything was quiet. Exactly the way he wanted it. Down the hallway, Lena's music played softly through the wall. The father turned off the kitchen light, and the house settled into the calm rhythm of another ordinary night. Saturday morning arrived slower than most mornings during the week. No alarm clock. No rush to get dressed for school. Sunlight slipped through the kitchen window in soft lines across the table. The father was already awake. He'd been sitting there for a while with a cup of coffee, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the block. Weekend sounds. Different rhythm. Lena eventually came down the hallway wearing an old sweatshirt and carrying her phone. "You're up early," she said. "I usually am." She opened the fridge and grabbed a carton of orange juice. "You still want to go today?" "Yes." She nodded once. "Range opens at 10, right?" "Yes." She poured herself a glass and sat down across from him. For a minute they just sat there. Morning light moved slowly across the table. Then she asked, "You nervous?" The father looked at her. "A little." She raised an eyebrow. "You said that the other day, too." "Yes, but you've done this a million times." He shook his head slightly. "Not like this." She understood what he meant. Teaching someone you loved carried a different kind of responsibility. They finished breakfast quietly. Then he stood up and walked to the cabinet. He opened it and entered the code. The lockbox clicked. Lena watched carefully. He removed the pistol, set it gently on the table. Before she even moved, she placed both hands flat on her knees. "Waiting," he noticed. "Good," he said. "What? You waited?" She smiled slightly. "You told me not to touch it until you said so." He nodded. "Correct." He checked the chamber. Empty. Then he slid the pistol across the table toward her. "Pick it up." She did. Carefully. Just the way he had shown her months earlier, with a training model borrowed from a friend. Her finger stayed straight along the frame. He nodded again. "How does it feel?" "Heavier than I expected." "That's normal." She adjusted her grip slightly. "Like this?" "Yes." He reached over and corrected her thumb position gently. "Better." She held it for a moment longer, then set it down. The father watched her closely. "You ready for the range?" "Yes." They packed quietly. Ear protection. A small box of ammunition. The pistol case. 20 minutes later they were back in the truck, the same passenger seat that had held the case 2 days earlier. Now Lena sat there instead, watching the road. "Did you go to ranges like this in the army?" she asked. "No." "What was different?" "Everything." She nodded slowly. He didn't explain further. Some differences didn't belong in stories. The range sat outside town near a wide stretch of open land. Nothing fancy, just a long gravel lot and a low building with faded paint. They parked and stepped out. The morning air smelled faintly of dust and sun-warmed grass. Inside, the man behind the counter checked their IDs and handed them lane passes. He barely glanced up. Another normal transaction. The father appreciated that. They walked down the shooting lanes together. Lena placed the ear protection over her head. "You remember the stance?" he asked. "Yes." She demonstrated. Feet steady. Arms extended. Not perfect, but close. He nodded. "Good." They started slowly. one round at a time. Each shot echoed through the range building in sharp bursts of sound. Lena flinched the first time, then steadied herself. By the fifth round, she was calmer. By the 10th, she was focused. The father stood slightly behind her shoulder, watching, not correcting every movement, just observing. When the box of ammunition was empty, she lowered the pistol and exhaled. That was louder than I thought. He nodded. Yes. She removed the ear protection and looked at the target downrange. Most of her shots had landed inside the outer rings. Not perfect, but controlled. She smiled. That's actually kind of satisfying. Yes. She handed the pistol back to him. Then she said something quietly. I get why you wanted one now. The father looked at her. Why? Not because of fear. He waited. She pointed toward the target. Because responsibility feels different when you understand what something can do. He nodded slowly. That's the point. They packed up their gear and walked back toward the truck. Lena looked thoughtful as they crossed the gravel lot. Then she said, You know what's funny? What? You almost didn't go to the store the other day. He remembered. He had stood in the driveway for nearly 10 minutes that morning deciding whether the purchase was really necessary. Yes, he said. I'm glad you did. He looked at her. So am I. They climbed back into the truck. The case rested between them. Secure. Quiet. Just another object again. But the father understood something now that he hadn't fully realized when he walked into the gun shop that morning. Protection wasn't only about the tool. It was about the lesson that came with it, and the person who would carry that lesson forward long after he was gone. The drive back from the range felt lighter. Not because anything dramatic had happened, just a quiet shift in the air between them. Lena sat with her elbow resting against the door, watching the road slide past. You were right about the safety rules, she said after a while. The father kept his eyes on the road. Which part? All of it. She looked down at her hands for a moment. It makes you think slower. That's the point. She nodded. When you held the pistol at the table the other day, you looked calm, she said. I thought it was because you were used to it. He didn't respond right away, but now I think it's something else. He glanced at her briefly. What? You respect it. He turned his attention back to the road. Yes. They passed the turnoff that led back toward town. The father slowed the truck slightly as they approached their street. Lena looked out the windshield toward the houses ahead. Do you ever think about those years? She asked. He knew what she meant. Yes. Every day? No. She waited. Some days more than others, he added. She seemed satisfied with that. The truck rolled into the driveway. The engine shut off. They carried the case back inside together. The house smelled faintly of coffee again. The same quiet warmth from earlier that morning. The father opened the cabinet, entered the code, placed the pistol back inside the lockbox, closed it. The click of the latch echoed softly in the kitchen. Lena watched. Then she said something that caught him slightly off guard. You know what I keep thinking about? What? That store. He looked at her. The gun shop? Yes. What about it? She leaned against the counter. You didn't tell me the full story. He gave a small breath through his nose. There's not much to tell. She raised an eyebrow. You came home with a refund slip in your pocket. He paused. You noticed that. I noticed things. That made him almost smile. He rested his hands on the counter. The clerks thought I didn't belong there. She tilted her head. Because of how you looked? Yes. That's stupid. Sometimes people decide things quickly. What happened? He thought about the moment again, the quiet shift when the owner had looked at his ID, the way she had spoken to the clerks afterward. She recognized my service. Lena's expression changed slightly. And then? She reminded the staff about respect. That's it? Mostly. She studied him for a second. You like that? Yes. Why? The father thought about the answer carefully. Because the truth wasn't really about him. Because she didn't make it about heroics, he said. What do you mean? She made it about dignity. Lena nodded slowly. That matters. Yes. They stood there in the quiet kitchen for a moment. Then Lena reached for an apple from the bowl on the table. As she took a bite, she said something thoughtful. You know what's funny? What? They judged you by the jacket. He looked down at the worn sleeves. Yes. She smiled slightly. But the owner looked at your hands. The father considered that. The scars. The steady grip. The things experience leaves behind without asking permission. Yes, he said quietly. She did. Lena finished the apple and tossed the core into the trash. Then she grabbed her backpack from the chair. I've got homework. He nodded. She started toward the hallway, then stopped halfway. Oh, one more thing. Yes? She looked back at him. When I'm older and someone walks into a place where I'm working. He waited. I'm going to remember that story. Which part? She shrugged. The part where you don't decide who someone is before they even speak. The father nodded once. That's a good rule. She smiled. See you later, Dad. Her door closed a moment later. The house returned to its quiet rhythm again. The father stood alone in the kitchen for a few minutes. He looked at the cabinet where the lockbox sat, then at the table where Lena had practiced holding the pistol 2 days earlier, then at the front door. Morning sunlight still stretched across the floor just like it had when he left for the gun shop. The same house, the same life. But something inside him had shifted slightly since that morning. Not pride, not validation, just a quiet reminder that dignity didn't come from recognition. It came from carrying yourself the same way, whether people understood you or not. He poured another cup of coffee, sat down at the table, and listened to the quiet sounds of the house that mattered more to him than any story he could ever tell.